Welcome to the AdaptX podcast, where we have conversations with individuals building accessible businesses, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Our intention is never to speak on behalf of those with disabilities, but rather to provide a platform that amplifies their voice and shares insights into a more accessible world. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Stephanie Cawthon, an internationally renowned author, researcher, and consultant, who brings relatable insights and real-world skills to her mission that, when we tap the power of accessibility, we ensure that disabled people can thrive and succeed. She's the author of Disability is Human, the Vital Power of Accessibility in Everyday Life, which will be released later this fall. Dr. Cawthon earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from Stanford University and her doctorate from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Her groundbreaking research has been funded by over $50 million in federal and local grants. In 2021, she founded the National Disability Center for Student Success at the University of Texas at Austin, where she is a tenured professor in educational psychology. She also brings a lived experience to her work. In addition to her congenital hearing loss, she has several mental health and physical disabilities that have a significant impact on her ability to engage in important life activities. This episode with Stephanie is unique in that it involves two interpreters, one translating my speech for Stephanie and another verbalizing her sign language back to me. So you'll notice that there are pauses between the conclusion of my statements and the response articulated by her interpreter, Amanda. So without further ado, Dr. Stephanie Cawthon.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. One thing to know about me is that my career, by and large, is in higher education. That's where I spend a lot of my time instructing, serving, researching. And what I noticed over the years is a lot of that information and that experience is just not available to the general public or a wider audience. And so while teaching that content and that content area of disability specifically, I've really tried to dive into some conversations and also figure out how do we start that conversation? What sparks it? And so one thing that I've noticed is that many people feel like they just don't know about disabilities. They don't know what to do. They don't have any foundational understanding or strategies in terms of how to approach disabilities or a person with a disability. And so what I wanted to do is give access to that broader audience to folks outside of a classroom. And so that book, in addition to its workbook that accompanies it, are both about access, the why and the how of access for folks with disabilities.
Yeah, as I was reading it, I found it to be an excellent resource for the health and fitness professionals that we work with that are often hesitant to engage with people with disabilities because they're afraid to say the wrong thing or they don't know etiquette wise how to approach that population. So unfortunately, they revert to saying nothing at all. And just kind of this stigma just becomes perpetuated and it's kind of cyclical and the afraid to converse, so neglect, and then the stigma is just amplified. So I think your text did a wonderful job for me in communicating some of the nuance within disability language. And yeah, so definitely going to be added to the recommended reading list for our AdaptX coaches who go through our curriculum once it's published, because I think it does a really good job of navigating that nuance and giving people actionable steps to improving how they can be more inclusive.
Well, what's interesting to me is that healthcare in that area, there is so much potential for improvement and action. It really hits so many people. It impacts so many people's lives every day. Fitness, exercise, healthcare, health and wellness. So I was thrilled to see your work, and it really does align with what we know about psychology, what we know about quality of life, literally everything. And so that area, in the recent past, I guess within the past 2 years, I've had the opportunity to visit a handful of hospitals, do some clinical training with clinicians and physicians, and it's very interesting. It's very motivating to help improve those services and do some work with those service providers.
Do you find that those professionals are receptive to kind of the social model lens as opposed to the strictly biomedical approach?
I would say typically yes. If I have any kind of personal connection to that person or facility, absolutely they do. Or if they have a connection on their own, a colleague, a friend, somebody they grew up with, immediately that's the in, and it's not difficult. What I see often, especially within communication and healthcare communication, anything in that vein, is that people working within that area are afraid of their supervisors and the higher ups in that space and what they would say. So they know on a personal level, they have ideas of what to do, language to use, labels, for lack of a better word, to use. But if it's not approved by that institution, by the place that they work in, that's where I often see a lot of potential for systemic wide change and improvement is as it goes up the chain.
Yeah, I feel like too often the research focuses exclusively on the physical environment and what accessibility features need to be addressed, when we kind of identified that education and knowledge of the professional, not of the disability themselves, is maybe more important to creating these more equitable and inclusive environments.
And when you said knowledge, I'd like to add to that mindset, just to kind of tag on to that. Any sort of flexibility, problem solving, and high expectations for success. I think those things all go in there. I have a few physical disabilities myself. And so when I'm looking for a trainer or someone to help me support me in my life and my lifestyle and in that space, it's the mindset of empathy, understanding, compassion, and just understanding some of my history over the years and different negative stigmas that are out there. That pervasive attitude that goes along with it also makes a difference. And so, you as a provider in the healthcare and fitness space, yeah, we've got, you're here, but this piece is new to you. Or let's say, you're working with a person, or when I work with a person with a disability, physical or otherwise, they come to this space and this time with a lot of history, a lot of frustrations. And so sometimes the most important thing right off the bat is just to take the time to listen and not judge or assume that despite any prior experience or history you have with the population. Because it turns out that none of us but the individual has enough experience with that specific individual to know what's going on or how they've arrived on that day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think two of the guiding principles for our coaches is to presume competence, not make assumptions, and then, like you said, to be empathetic, not sympathetic, because sympathetic creates this lens of the individual that you're supporting or coaching being almost inferior. And it comes from a place of pity more so than respect and understanding. So we talk about vertical versus horizontal relationships when we have our coaches working with some of our young adults and adolescents with disabilities, where you're interacting on a level field as if you're peers and equals. It's too often that with inclusion, I feel like it's often reserved for the nonprofit space, which kind of leads to this charity mindset that you're supporting someone less fortunate or lesser than you as opposed to as a peer. So that's one of the first things that we try to communicate with our coaches and our volunteers.
Sure. And I love that about your training, what you just outlined. I wonder what other things you do early on in that process to develop that capacity, because I really loved what you just said.
Yeah. Well, we introduced the social model first. For people who have no exposure to it, I think it's an interesting perspective. Just the idea that it's not the individual and the specific characteristics of their diagnosis, but the environment and the barriers within your environment. And I think that shifts the burden of accessibility to the professional. And it can be empowering in a way that kind of alleviates some of the concerns, I guess, because we can't know everything about every diagnosis. And like you said, the best way to learn about an individual is not through their label or diagnosis, but it's through conversation. But I think a lot of personal trainers and health and fitness professionals who don't have access to disability are overwhelmed by the complexity of it. And we try to just lower that barrier by just making it seem as normal as possible. Like you're conversing with someone who has a unique set of characteristics, and it's not their disability or diagnosis that matters, but it's who they are as a human. So I guess that aligns nicely with your book title, at least.
Yeah, and there's an example that I have from a few years ago in the workplace. I had a colleague. We were hiring in this particular time and place, and one applicant was a very strong candidate, but they had a disability and really a different type of experience for them. And I clearly won't name names. Confidentiality is of the utmost importance, of course. But a supervisor said, I don't know what to do with that disability. I can't hire them. I don't know what to do. And so my response immediately was, that's not legal. Your capacity is what's limited in this situation, and not them. It's your capacity, it's your understanding of the situation. And so we really need to think these things through when we respond. Where is it coming from? Is it my perception, my ability, or is it my perception of their ability? Because if it's me and my perception that's got the issue, what do I need to do? What can I do? How can I navigate that? And so that's really why my book is targeting that population of people without disabilities, because I really kind of dive into stuff like this.
Yeah, and I glossed over it and didn't introduce you particularly well, but you have a very accomplished academic background as well as career. Do you want to maybe highlight kind of what that was like? Maybe what accommodations you found to be useful going through high school, going through university, as well as maybe what assumptions you were met with as a student who was deaf?
One thing that's interesting for me specifically is that I grew up in a time before the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, before legal protections were in place. So I did not have accessibility support back then growing up. I sat in the front of the classroom, I read lips, and I did that all the way through college. So that was my experience. I didn't have access to sign language at all growing up. That just wasn't part of my life. It wasn't part of the culture. There was an attitude at that time where it was focused heavily on speech reading and lip reading, and sign language wasn't even considered part of the support process for me in my context and in my time. None of my family signed. Now, when I went to college, I was then exposed to two things. The first of which was that lip reading does not work. There are 300 students in one classroom. That is not going to happen. Many of them are sitting behind me. That doesn't work. In fact, I remember one time I was sitting with my boyfriend at the time, and we were sitting side by side. We were in the same class, and I would ask him, what's happening, what's going on? And the room had 300 students. We were in one of those big auditorium style classes. And so I didn't think the teacher noticed. And then later on, I went to the office hours of that same professor. I was asking about a paper or something. And she looked at me and said, I don't know why you're coming to me. Why are you here? You're always talking during class. You're always asking questions to your neighbor. And I said, that would be because I can't hear you. And she said, well, whatever, it doesn't matter, regardless of that. And it was just so interesting. And I was like, no, hold on. I don't have access to you. I can't understand you. So that's why I'm asking questions. So that was a fascinating moment for me. She assumed the worst about me, whereas I was trying to make my own way. I was trying to self-accommodate and understand what was happening in a different way. And listen, I self-accommodated for many, many years. So then when I got here to the University of Texas at Austin here, so many years later, but here I kind of started with the same approach. I did what I knew. It did not work. It was not working for me. It was literally impossible for me to do my job without actual access. So I started to acquire sign language, and I started to ask for actual accommodations and getting interpreters and gaining access in that way. And typically for me, that's it. The accommodation that I use is sign language and an interpreter. I self-accommodate all the time in other situations and do other things. But to answer your question, that's what I use. And that's a different situation. But what I noticed too with students, about half, I would give it about 50% don't disclose their disability or their diagnosis. They self-accommodate, they suffer through, they barely get by, just as a practice. That's what I've noticed.
When did you shift from self-accommodating to advocating for yourself, or is there even like a delineation between the two?
Well, two things. Yes, there's a very clear line, a very clear timeline for me that really stands out in my mind. The first is when I had access to the language, to American Sign Language, a visual language that was clearly accessible for me. And I learned because I had two deaf students who came to me for mentoring, and they only use sign language. And I was like, OMG, what am I doing? What am I going to do? So I learned the language. And then it became for me, not for them, right? In that moment, it was for me to chat with them and to be able to work with them. But then it also became for me. So that was really, really interesting. That became for me on a personal level. So getting here and having two deaf peers, but I didn't have access to the language. I needed to learn it. But prior to that, I never met a deaf person. I didn't have access to the language or the social piece of it. And then the second thing for me that's real interesting is I had a performance review for my teaching, and I signed that course. And I remember that I signed it because I had two deaf students taking that course. And then I also had a teaching assistant or a TA who was deaf in that particular course. So I chose to use sign language for the vast majority of that course. I can voice for myself if I need to. I can use my voice and speak in English. It's not fun to do it though, like to access half of a conversation or an interaction in sign language, but then turn on my voice to respond in English. It's best to pick a language and stay there. That was a side note. Anywho, so the performance reviewer was used to me speaking in English because that's how they'd always known me. And they were very upset to see me using sign language in that space when they came to do my review. Very interesting attitude. They were like, she's a really good teacher, but because of her disability, like it was very demeaning, very, very negative experience for me. So I had to advocate for myself in my own department. And I'm like, this review cannot stay on my record. What? This cannot stay. This cannot be part of my file. So this was my first sort of public exposure to a system like the hearing system, where I'm like, hello, this is a part of my life. This should not depend on which language I choose. But I was then exposed to this system that was very much auditory and hearing culture based. And yeah, that was an interesting experience, to say the least.
One point that we use when trying to convey the social model is this idea that disability is context dependent. And I wonder if you find this accurate or offensive isn't the word, but we use an example where in a room full of people who are deaf, who all use ASL to communicate, the fact that they can't hear isn't necessarily a disability. But if I were to walk into that room, I would not be able to communicate. Do you think that's a fair explanation of that concept, or is that an oversimplification?
No, not at all. In fact, I may just expand a little bit. Disability as an identity, maybe the person has a connection to the concept of disability, right? That's not context dependent necessarily, the idea of disability. Now, my experience can be disabling. That is context dependent 100%.
Yeah,
So I find there to be a difference.
For the audience who obviously hasn't had the opportunity to read your book yet, and we encourage them to, but you talk a little bit about disabled, the word disabled, and the common euphemisms that are used, like differently abled. Maybe can you summarize that topic a little bit in terms of how you approach the concern of saying the word disabled or disability, and people opting for quote unquote politically correct euphemisms? I didn't phrase that question very well, but I think you probably understand the gist of it.
Yeah, but what I would like to do is back up just a smidge. I think one thing to remember is that language evolves constantly. It's a constant shift. And I see people who are 40, I work with different groups of folks, people in their 60s, their 40s, their 20s. So they're just different groups of people. And each of those different age groups have different expectations of language use and the way they use language. And I think it depends on when you develop language, when you develop your personal or personality type language. And so I think everyone approaches it differently. So I think one approach is not going to fit all. I've seen and heard a lot of resistance to person first language compared to identity first language. So that's an interesting choice, and really it is a choice, and people choose it differently for different reasons. And so what I encourage people to do is to ask if there is a particular person or a group in mind and you're not sure of their preference. Just ask if they have a preference. And so I would say I use both person's first language, identity first language, depending on the situation, the context, the person, depending on who I'm even speaking to. I don't want it to become an issue. It's not usually the crux of the conversation anyway. And so I respect the fact that people have a different preference than I do within the same community. And so often I just follow the person that I'm speaking to or about. For me, right now, I prefer identity first language that feels very much empowering, more so than person first, because it's a part of who I am. It's not just something that people are talking about. So for me, at this time and space, it's identity first, and they're different. Now, disability feels harder to say. It feels more like a disclosure. It feels less safe. Person first sometimes feels more safe. So I'm trying to be brave. And so that's where I am right now today.
Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago when I was getting my special education degree, it was kind of hammered home that person first language was the most respectful and the only way to talk about disability. And then the more of these conversations that I had with individuals with disabilities and not with teachers and professors who don't identify with having a disability, we found that identity first language became pretty popular and preferred in those by those individuals. And we started trying to put together a disability language and etiquette document to share with the coaches who go through our course. And it was tough to make blanket statements because there is that nuance and individual preference. So do you think developing a document or a resource is a futile task? Or do you think there's a way that I could articulate the nuances of this conversation for personal trainers and physical therapists that might want to have a better understanding of disability language?
I think awareness of, at the very least, those two types of categories, I think that that's helpful for sure. One thing that I've noticed is, well, for me personally, is hearing impaired. That word impaired makes my insides just sort of die. It's not good. I don't usually say anything if someone uses that term, but inside, the impact is real. It really, really gets me. And so I feel like figuring out where that sensitivity line is and what feels sensitive and respectful, it moves, and I get that. But if there are other options, maybe use those. Not a free for all, if you know what I mean. There are safer options, more respectful options, and then there are some that I just can't.
Yeah, we're trying to crowdsource that document so there's as many different voices in the disabled community identifying their preferences and sharing their preferences. Although when you say impairment is a word that you don't love, it does. One of the presentations on the social model, we talk about the difference between an impairment and a disability, and an impairment being the specific characteristics of a diagnosis, and a disability being the lack of access to an environment due to the environment. Do you think that's an okay way to use the term impairment, or should I just use maybe characteristics?
I mean, honestly, that explanation is very detailed compared with what I see out in the world. So very, very much different, because often the word impairment does come from special education or the medical model. And so that's the lens through which it's used. And then it's just applied to everything. They don't often use it in your specific explanation or intention. I think most people can't really process what you just explained and they don't use the term impairment in that way. That's a very different way.
Yeah. I liked in the book, you said that legal policies only set the stage for change, but it's up to us to make it a reality, I believe was the quote. How can an individual without a disability be an effective advocate or an ally for those with disabilities? How can we, I guess, be a part of making it a reality?
Sure. When I do a presentation or host a workshop or a training, that is often a question. How can that group apply it to them, to their world? So pretty much similar to what you asked me. So I guess it would then come to a call to action, right? Sort of what it boils down to. And what I typically say is there's not a checklist, but there are things you can do. There are things you can do. I just encourage people to think about where it fits within their life and their work. What's the sort of next step for them in their own personal space? Like, just kind of think of one thing. And for each person, it could be different. Now, you are really advanced. You're training people about language. And I mean, so I wouldn't say the same things to you as I would to somebody in a hospital setting who's asked the same question, who maybe they're just, they're trying to design accessibility for a new client or something. But so what I would say is there are a few basic level things to pay attention to attend to when you're out and about in your spaces. You have access to disabled people in your life, in your world. Get their perspective. Many people don't. So you specifically, you do. And you know that you do. Often people don't think that they do, whether they do or not. They just don't know. They don't follow someone on Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever. They don't, or they don't follow them with intention to read and really dig into that space. So I say expand your content, what you're intaking out there on the web, who you're around. Also, a second thing for me would be to recognize kind of the idea of disclosure. I often say that the percentage, or it has been said that the percentage is about 25% of anyone that you're around has a disability. That's more than people anticipate. And the world is not designed for that 25%. So when you enter, let's say, a store or even a website, wherever you go, it kind of just notice, is this place or space accessible? What would it take to make it? Make it accessible. Take inventory. Make a list. Maybe it's not your responsibility, sure. But if you notice something, if you start to just observe and notice these things, I think that's a good step. Often I'll say to people is Zoom life and internet life, that's all of us now. I'll say, do you have closed captioning on? Is it an automatic setting in your meetings? It could be. Or are you waiting for someone to ask for it? You don't have to wait. That's a simple thing. It's in a setting. It's right there. Just turn it on. Now, if you need to turn it off for some other reason, why not? But why not set up the expectation that it's accessible to everyone in your call, in your meeting? Just little bitty things like that. Like, why wait? Turn it on. If you got to turn it off, fine. But let it be the automatic response to have captioning on. Just little things like that,
Yeah, I don't know if I would be considered advanced, but kind of like in your book, you mentioned not having all the right answers, but that you like to ask great questions. And that's, I guess, what this podcast and some of the work that I do allows me to. No, I only ask because sometimes in like my LinkedIn space, like you mentioned, a lot of the people that I follow are disabled voices and advocates for people with disabilities, but you so often hear the phrase like nothing about us without us. And I completely understand the premise of it and the importance of it, but it almost makes me feel like an imposter to a degree. Like I've kind of dedicated the last 15 years of my life to inclusion within athletics and sports, but there's still this lingering like, this isn't my space. Like I don't belong in this space. Like I can be an advocate and an ally, but is it really my role to be teaching other people? So at the end of the day, I guess I have my gym. We have 70 clients with disabilities that train with us alongside a couple hundred without. And I have lived experience in some ways, but I also can recognize my shortcomings and where I have to allow other people, I guess, to speak and to educate.
Sure, but your resources, what you have, what you access, those aren't always available to everybody. That it's a huge win for everyone in your community, exposure to just the idea that you exist. You're there. This is great. That's enough. You are a resource. And another thing for me within this space, I recognize that disability does not stand alone. It's an intersectional experience. And so for white people with money, it's a different experience than people who don't have those privileges. It just is. And for me, that's a really important kind of next level understanding of equity and how people experience this. Access is one thing, but equity is an entirely different thing. And it's huge. It's huge. And it's a big goal for us to get there to equity. I think we're on the way, but I think it's a long time before we can say that things are equitable. But learning how to empower other is step one, and it seems like you've figured out at least a little bit of how to do that, empowering others, and I think that's a big step.
What do you think the fitness industry as a whole could do more effectively to become more equitable and accessible?
My experience is only here in Texas and recently. I grew up in California. And so for me, I'd have to limit it to what I know. And when you say fitness, to me, the first thing I think of is a place to go, a support system, and a resource to be leveraged. And so those are already sort of ripe with equity because we're there for a reason, going somewhere. But so I don't see the fitness industry as an exception, I guess, at all. I think lots of systems look like that. So generally, any answer I give, I guess, would be applicable to any system out there.
I guess what characteristics or approaches do you think would make a fitness professional more effective at supporting people with disabilities? Like, what would you look for if you were seeking out a trainer?
You know, that's funny because I'm in the midst of that right now. Um, gosh. So for me, I'm looking for somebody who understands the complexity of fitness and disability and health and how that all kind of comes together. So it's an interesting handful of things, because I see a lot of people will say, oh, you should go to a specific type of gym, or you should do this exercise, or eat this particular type of food, or be on this food plan, this exercise plan. But it's not really ever thought of about adapting that plan. So for me, then it's incumbent upon me to figure out, can I, can't I? And that's a lot. And so for me, I'd love to be able to find someone who's a collaborator, who we can find this plan and this plan and this plan and bring them together, versus someone prescribing a plan to me and then I figure out how to adapt it. So that sort of goes back to one thing that I often say is, let's talk about accommodations or adaptability in the design phase instead of handing me this thing that exists and now I got to figure out how to adapt it and accommodate it later. Then if I get something like that, I'm like, that's just not for me. That's not for somebody with a disability. That's for somebody else. Because then I feel like I am less than. I can't do this plan that everybody's talking about and subscribing to. So that's disheartening for me, and actually makes me feel worse about myself at the beginning of this journey, because there isn't something that's adaptable right off the bat.
Yeah, I guess that reiterates the importance of that first session with someone with a disability, building that rapport, having those having that conversation to understand how to support you. So you're designing with accessibility in mind from the beginning, as opposed to trying to retrofit it for what you need down the line. Would you be more comfortable in an environment exclusively with other individuals who are deaf, or would you prefer to exercise in an environment with people of all different abilities?
Well, so that's interesting. So part of it is about communication. Obviously, it'd be nice to have other people that I could chat with and communicate with in sign language. But for me, it's my other disabilities that impact my ability to exercise and access a fitness space, not my deafness. So that's more important for me at this space, to have I would love a space with other people with a range of abilities in that gym or in that fitness space. So yes, communication is a big deal, but ability to be able to do these exercises is a big deal, because a gym and and most gyms, my gym specifically, is full of 20-year-olds. So that's not a good fit for me. I already feel like I'm the old lady here. I'm trying to do this new exercise. So a range is more important to me at this point than anything else, a range of abilities and different folks in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I ask because I think too often the inclusion of people with disabilities in fitness program or fitness environments is seen as a sub-separate program. Like we have our adaptive fitness program that meets once or twice a week, and not diminishing the importance of that. But to us, I guess inclusion is giving people the opportunity to decide when, how, and with who they train with. So if the only opportunity you have for someone who identifies as having a disability is once or twice a week at a specific time, then that's not very equitable or inclusive.
Yeah, I've got two examples to tag on to that. So yoga. I used to be really into yoga. I loved it. But it's really hard to understand what's going on if you can't hear the instructor. I was always behind, so I was never like on the same timeline as the rest of the class. So that was difficult. Um, and then the second thing that I was thinking about was oh, just classes are harder than a one-on-one situation. One-on-one, for me, I think, most people can figure that out. I think that works. But a class, when I see that everyone is in there and they appear to be on an advanced level, the adaption part really needs to be in it from the beginning for me. Otherwise, it's like that's tough, a class. And most people know now to give level 1, 2, and 3. That's just kind of the way fitness classes are being taught. But I see often classes with people with disabilities are like figuring out what's going on, or the person with the disability has to modify it themselves, and then then we're way behind. We got to figure out what the exercise is, and then how do we modify it, what does it look like. So
Yeah, absolutely. We maybe it's too rudimentary or simplifying it, but we have a reflection activity in the course, and we ask trainers to think about a class that they recently taught and then think if a client was unable to hear, would they be able to access all of it? If they're unable to see, would they be able to access? So if they're unable to walk, would they be able to access? And then we ask them to think of what we call lateralizations. Sorry, that's probably not a great word to sign. Like not necessarily progressions and regressions to every exercise, but like you said, modifications if clients need a modification. So yeah, I don't know if that's a good way of thinking of it, or maybe that's making it too simplified, but I think it's at least a good reflection activity. I liked how you had a lot of reflection things throughout your book that really reiterated points that you made throughout the chapters.
yeah, thank you. That was actually the fun part. Oh, and one thing for me is I try to build relationships with those instructors that I'm working with. So when it's small enough, over time, I'm going there weekly or what have you, that relationship really then means when I get there, they know me, right? They're like, we're to the point where like we'll know where we're at in the planning, and so they can predict, they can anticipate, they can look at me and be like, hey, and do that instead. And it sort of takes a lot of the onus off of me and puts it on them. Like once they know me, then they know, Stephanie's here, hey, how you doing? They'll look at me, and it's not a big deal, right? And then it becomes not a big deal. And I feel like you do that. That's kind of what I'm getting from you. And
Yeah.
then, obviously, if I see other people using my modifications, that's good, because maybe that day they need a modification. So that's something for me too. And it's kind of funny, like when I notice that, like YouTube, okay.
This is kind of a self-serving question, more so than one that is targeted to our audience and the podcast as a whole. But I'm kind of wrapping up a far less impressive and thorough project, just writing a text about how we create more inclusive fitness environments and kind of what we do at my gym, I guess, because I had a lot of people that took our course reach out and express interest in maybe opening their own gyms at some point. So I started just trying to kind of put together this resource. My gym's a little unique in that it's a for-profit facility that was started with inclusion in mind from the beginning. I was running a lot of Special Olympic programs and decided instead of becoming a special education teacher, I wanted to do something more active. And I was also working with some high school like varsity athletics as well. And I just wanted to create a space for both of those populations that I really enjoyed working with to train together. So that was kind of like the conception of my gym. But one thing I'm having trouble with wrapping up this book that I'm writing, it'll probably just be released as a digital product, but is deciding what to include and what to omit. I feel like there's so many things I want to talk about, and I have this lingering feeling that like, oh, I didn't include something that someone's going to need to know, and I'm doing them a disservice by not writing it. But at the same time, I don't know what that is. So I don't know if, again, I don't know if I'm articulating that well, but I'm having this sense of incompletion that I'm having a hard time getting over. So I wonder if, I guess, what your process was of writing your book. Did you start with an outline? Did you start with objectives and then work backwards? And then how did you come to the point where you felt like it was complete?
Oh, all right. Well, I start with notes, just brainstorming notes, ideas, just jotting all those down. I had a coach, honestly. I had a coach. Mimi Fox is her name, and she has a group that she runs, that she facilitates a couple of times a year. It's a small group. It's about 10 authors, 10 writers in there. And she's very successful because she gives a structure of how to think about what you have to say and what maybe you don't need to say. You could kind of drop for now, what's in and what's out. So she provides that. That helped me a lot with this book. And so that process, working with her, was an intensive weekly meeting for 6 weeks. She helped walk me through, honestly, reading in front of other people. Oh my, that was rough. But it helped to see what clicks with folks, what they get right away. What did they see? What did they get? And what were they like, wait, what? I don't get that. Say that again. Could you explain that? What did you mean? So that really helped me. And that was helpful to other people as well. And it also functioned as an accountability group. So that for a timeline and all the things. So that really helped me again on this particular book. And I'm happy to share that information with you again if you like. But then a third thing was hiring an editor. Actually, I had two. The first one was a conceptual editor. And that's maybe at the point you are right now. You've got ideas, you've written some things, but maybe it's not in the order, maybe it's not flowing. What do you keep? What do you drop? And so hire someone but that's what I did. Hire someone to get feedback. It's not a long-term relationship. It's short and sweet. It's once and done. We talked about it. I explained my goals and they said, all right, give it to me. Give it all to me. Give me everything you got. I gave her like, oh, heaven's sakes, I don't know, 300 pages. And I was like, I don't know if you're going to be able to make sense of these pages, but she was a concept editor. So that's what I did. Concept editor, like I say, is what she did. Then it was toward the end, it was a copy editor that I engaged. And she had opinions. They were very different people, very different. Sometimes they said the same things, but for me, I wanted wildly different perspectives. I wanted someone for the concept to be rooted in disability because that's where experience lies. That's what I wanted. But I didn't want her diving into my word choices and wordsmithing my stuff. That's not what I wanted. The copy editor, on the other hand, would say, do you know what? That part of that paragraph, it's too much. It's extra. You don't need it. Or that story, too much. Get rid of it. But the structure was already set. The chapters were set. I didn't need any more help with chapter 9, chapter 10. That was my work after I got it back from my first editor. So they functioned as bookends for my process. That was very specific. I don't know if you were looking for all those details,
No,
but
that was,
that's how I approached this particular book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is kind of what because I'm thinking, does that copy editor or that conceptual person understand disability as thoroughly as you? And if they don't, can they really guide that process for you? Like, how do they know what's extraneous and what's important if they haven't lived it themselves and experienced it themselves?
Sure. Well, and again, that's why I started off with that content or concept editor. She had personal and professional experience. And then the copy editor didn't really know much about it, but she showed up curious. She had lots of questions, which was really helpful for me because if she doesn't have experience, my audience doesn't have experience. She was perfect because when she's asking me these questions, I realized, my readers are going to have the same questions. And so that really helped flesh it out there at the end. So to your point, the first person I engaged did have all that experience, and that's what I needed. The second person did not, and that's what I needed at that time.
Yeah, that's I'm kind of sharing the text with some of my clients who have disabilities to see if it accurately represents their experience. And then I'm also sharing it with fitness professionals who have no disability experience and being like, okay, if you were going to open a gym, how close does this text get you to feeling comfortable doing so? And that's kind of, I guess, the next process that I'm going through. And then maybe I'll have to see if that conceptual editor would be interested in taking on another project that you worked with. But I started following Mimi Fox after you shared some of her stuff a couple months back. So I've seen her resources as well. What do you hope readers take away from your book?
I hope that it reduces fear. If people are fearful, I hope that that gives them some encouragement and some hope. I'm also hopeful that it gives people a starting point, right? Some inspiration, maybe for themselves on an individual level, and an action plan for later. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not a one-step. Not my book, but the way that you approach this in life, right? These are steps, and that's what I hope is outlined for people, and they take those steps away from the book.
Do you think you wrote it more so for people with disabilities or for employers, key stakeholders that want to become more inclusive and create more accessible products, options, et cetera?
Definitely the second group that you just explained. There are many people with disabilities who are far better authors or writers than I am. So their stories are just incredible. And so I'm not trying to tell them anything. I'm not trying to tell their story again or replace it. So definitely I wrote it with the outside audience in mind, people without disabilities. And that's where I'm hoping it translates, is to those people.
And for those people who are interested in pre-ordering or ordering your book, where is the best place for them to find it? We can include a direct link in the show notes, but maybe this is when is it being published and where could they find it?
All right. So my website is a good place to start. We've got Disability is Human. There's a website out there for it. It's disabilityishuman.com. And that's where everything is at. We house everything there. The book, swag, other such things, and anything that's added along the way will be accessible on that website. The when is right now. We're scheduled for the middle of September to publish and launch the release there. So it's coming up soon.
Absolutely. Do you anticipate recording it as an audiobook as well, or predominantly print copies?
100% there will be an audio version published and out there. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I figured that would be the most accessible way to deliver it in both mediums.
Yeah, but it won't be me. I won't be the one speaking through it. I'll hire a voice actor to do the audio recording for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe I'll be able to find it on Audible as well. I feel like most of the texts that I consume these days are while I run or while I'm in the car, and it's often in audio format. So I feel like that's just a pretty accessible way for me to consume as much as possible versus always having a hard copy of text.
Sure. And there are many visual design parts to the book that I want it to feel friendly as well. So I hope that people, use it and appreciate it. And I think it's going to be good.
Sure they will. And hopefully we'll be able to send some people towards it. When we release this episode, we'll also give away a copy of the book to a listener as well. And we'll include show notes in the show notes, link to disabilitieshuman.com to make it a little easier for people to find it. We'll include your LinkedIn page, any other channels that you think would be relevant for people or that you would want people to follow you on.
Oh, Instagram. I'm on Instagram, so we can include that. Mm-hmm.
So we'll get both of those from you so we can include them. But Stephanie, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks so much for sharing your book and for writing it. And looking forward to sharing this with our listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was an awesome interview, a great podcast, and thank you to my interpreters as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Amanda. Audrey, thank you it was a unique experience for me as well. It gives me a lot to think about in terms of, I guess maybe Stephanie, if you don't mind, one more quick question. How do you think podcasts could be more accessible for those who are deaf or hard of hearing?
Well, I think a transcript, number one, have that available. If you don't have access to a transcript, it's very limiting for accessibility. I appreciate when people record a video and then publish said video. It's just, and then add captions to the video. If there's sign language involved, obviously fabulous. But I know that that's unique for this medium. When you have deaf people involved, that changes things. I get that. But I think, there are so many disabilities represented on your show. So so you're doing that already, right? Yeah. But to answer your question, captioning on a video and a transcript for sure make it more accessible.
Yeah, we definitely do both. So, well, thank you again. I really appreciate this conversation and having you in our community now. So.
Well, sure. This is very exciting for me. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Amanda, Audrey, thank you for the help. Stephanie, thanks for your time, all of your time. Thank you for listening to the AdaptX podcast. Our effort to amplify the ideas of our guests and create more inclusive and accessible industries is futile unless these episodes reach a larger audience. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please leave us a rating or a review on whichever platform you use. And if you would like to learn more about AdaptX, the course that we teach to health and fitness professionals and the projects that our organization is working on, you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website, www.adaptx.org. Until next Monday.